Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to everybody across Australia and overseas. Thank you for joining us for this AIEC webinar, International Education, Australia's Road Ahead. We've got a great attendance. We've got a capacity of 1,000 people registered to join us today. And I can see that people are piling through the virtual door, so I will speak slowly for a moment just to allow more people to get in before I get into the introduction. As I'm sure you're aware, we've got a stellar expert panel for the webinar today, and I will introduce them shortly. My name is James Bennett. I'm the Head of Business Delivery and Business Evolution at the IDP Connect ANZ team, and I've been a member of the AIEC Steering Committee since 2012. Before we get into the housekeeping and introductions, I just would like to take a couple of minutes to talk briefly about the AIEC. AIEC is hosted jointly by IDP Education and the IEAA and is led by a steering committee comprising of members from both those organisations, IEAA and IDP. The conference is primarily a physical gathering of professionals working in international education who come together each year to learn, network and explore different business opportunities with one another. AIEC is attended by professionals from all education sectors, so that's higher education, vets, schools, ELICOS and pathways, as well as government and private sector bodies. So it's usually the place to be in October for people working in international education. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you're aware, AIEC 2020 on the Gold Coast is unable to go ahead as planned and has been postponed until October 2021. So do keep an eye out for details of that later in the year as we firm up the details. But since you can't all come to AIEC this year, we want to bring key elements of AIEC to you. We want to stay connected with you, keep you informed as best we can. And since I think none of us have quite yet had enough of webinars in the past few months, we thought we'd kick it off with this one today. There are also many other ways to stay in touch and keep informed. You'll see those on the screen shortly, the different handles and links to social media for AIEC. So please make sure you take the time to connect with us and connect in with us, give feedback and see what's happening. Now, before I introduce the panel and we get the webinar started properly, there are just a couple of housekeeping points I'd like to go through with you. We are recording the session today, and a link to the recording will be updated onto the AIEC website in the next day or two for you to access and share amongst those who perhaps couldn't make it today. There's going to be quite a bit of data in a couple of the sessions, so I suggest you make your screens as large as possible so you can see all the charts and data that are on them. But as I say, if you miss anything, it'll be on the recording and you can always pause and study at your leisure. We will have some time at the end for questions at the end of the presentation. So please, at any point from now on or from when the presentations begin, please submit your questions through the webinar app. Nobody is able to speak verbally, but you can submit questions, written questions, which I will look at towards the end, and I will put as many as possible to the panel, and they'll be able to respond verbally to you. So please, at any point, type your questions in and send them through, and we'll get through what we can. Okay, I think that's enough for me. I'd like to introduce our panel, not that they need much introduction. I think you're very familiar with them all. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Phil Honeywood. Phil, as you know, is the CEO of IEAA. He's also the chair of the Australian Government's Global Reputation Task Force, and he's a fellow AIEC Steering Committee member with me. Andrew Wharton, Client Director in the IDP Connect ANZ team, will follow with some further insights from the recent IDP Connect Research International Student Crossroads. And finally, with a view from Austrade, we welcome Rebecca Hall, Head of International Education Centre of Excellence. So I think we are ready to go. We've still got people coming in, but there's a lot to get through, so I'll hand over to Phil to get us started. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, James, and to everybody who's joined us, I hope that your jobs are secure, your family and friends are safe, and that really you're taking some time to probably look at your skill set and how in this COVID world we might be able to improve on our IT skills. I know I certainly am in terms of all the webinars and the other virtual and other types of learning that we have to and teaching we have to do. So I'm also a proud member of the AIEC committee, and IEA is very pleased to have partnered now with IDP for over a decade in running the conference. And I think we might just go straight into my slides, and there's a fair bit of content to get through. So I wanted to start out suggesting, and I know a number of you are offshore and maybe work in competitor countries, but of course we're all collaborators. So I'm starting off with, I guess, what could be a good news story for Australia compared to some of our competitor study destination countries and our countries in our own region. And that is that relative to most countries, we have seemed to have contained the virus fairly well. We've only just gone past 100 deaths, which is wonderful. Well, it's terrible for obviously any figure, but relative to many others, we've been able to keep the virus fairly well contained. And of course, what we're finding is the curve is coming down when it comes to the number of people that are catching the virus. It's tended to be, for Australia, a large number who've come off cruise ships, unfortunately, and that's caused a number of clusters to take place. So I guess our advantage there is other countries' unfortunate sort of situation, and therefore it does create a competitive advantage, because many families, when our borders reopen, many families will think that perhaps Australia is a relatively safe country for their children to come and study in again. Obviously, our February-March intake in that context is looking better for next year compared to many of our Northern Hemisphere competitor countries, which tends to have an August-September major intake date. So we're well positioned, having lost out a large number of students, particularly Chinese students, who many of them went back or were caught in China for Lunar New Year celebrations. And of course, we now find that we've got approximately 40,000 Chinese students who have student visas to come to Australia and haven't been able to take up their place here in Australia because of being caught back in China, although many of them were able to come via a third country, self-quarantine for 14 days in a third country before entering Australia, before the borders were finally closed. So the timing and the calendar might assist in getting an intake. Importantly, we have a national cabinet process. So one of the problems Australia has as a federation, a bit like Canada, is that we have different state and territory governments who often like to have their own policies. However, during the crisis, the pandemic, we've found that every state premier and territory chief minister and our federal government have come together every week for a national cabinet to discuss issues of mutual concern. And so what we're finding is that now already we've got many of our states are now actually looking at opening the borders for new international students and returning, mostly emphasis on returning international students who've already had a student visa to Australia, to come in hopefully from July. Now, we think there'll be small pilot program cohorts, and we don't think, as I said, many of them will be new students, although I'm pleased to say that our Home Affairs Department, which had hit the pause button on approving new student visas, has been issuing new student visas in countries such as China now for some weeks. It's just whether the student can actually get here that's going to be the big issue. Obviously, our Australian dollar is well positioned compared to key competitor countries. Some of us recall that only a few years ago, the Australian dollar was at parity with the US dollar, and we're now at 65 cents. So that helps on affordability. And I guess for some of us, it's been a pleasant surprise that our national regulators, our Tertiary Education Quality Standards Authority and our Australian Skills Quality Authority, that regulate both public and private education providers in this country, have actually been very flexible. They've been willing to look at their regulations and see where online learning recognition can be given maximum support. And we've got now quite a few international students who've commenced their study offshore in an online mode, and then are hoping to get a student visa subsequently to come to Australia and have face-to-face. I think in all of that, a country such as Australia has got a wonderful pedagogical advantage, and that is that, as we know, many students, particularly in our Indo-Pacific region, learn through rote learning, as I did in Japan when I was an exchange student. And what they get from Australia, if the Australian education provider does things well, they actually get critical thinking, creative learning, team-based project work, and that is in accord with what international employers, global corporations now want. They want critical thinkers, they want young people who are willing to work in teams across cultures and are interculturally competent. So that's the pedagogical advantage, the teaching advantage, if you like, that Australia has, and we have to make sure we don't lose that and dilute that. But then we come to, I guess, the next slide, which is really the flip side. And one thing that's become apparent, unfortunately, colleagues, is that international education in a country like Australia hasn't done as well as it could to communicate the benefits of what we do to the wider Australian domestic community. And we've had, unfortunately, some racist issues in the streets, not many, but enough to cause embarrassment and concern as a welcoming country. We've also, of course, had issues with the international student welfare and hardship, whilst many of our education providers and our state governments and even our city governments have really done a great job in coming forward with genuine hardship funds, accommodation, sort of rent relief, free food, many other support mechanisms. We haven't been able to really coordinate that in the way I would like as the chairman of the Global Reputation Task Force. Our national federal government has put in $200 million in a community support fund, but our concern there is that that's not money that's only available to international students. There's about 540,000 international students, but another 1.5 million people are on temporary visas as temporary workers in Australia. And so you've got 2 million people that are entitled to access that $200 million community support fund. So compared to some other countries such as the UK, New Zealand, Canada, our, I guess, coordination on student welfare and hardship support has not been as good as it could have been. And after some months of lobbying, we're still waiting on a student visa flexibility package, which we keep on being told is coming. I have direct phone calls with the acting immigration minister. He's promised me that it's just around the corner, but some of those student visa flexibilities require national cabinet or federal cabinet approval, and because they've got a revenue implication. So at the moment, because Parliament and cabinet, and whereas the national cabinet's meeting every week, the federal government cabinet is not meeting to put things through the budget as often. So we've had to take our place in the queue to try and get that student visa flexibility package approved, which goes to a whole range of issues, such as the need, colleagues, for students who have started their study program offshore online to be able to get flexibility to qualify for their post-study work right visa and have that online period offshore approved within the requirements of how many months of study you have to do to qualify for the 2-year post-study work right visa. It includes proposals for student visa waiver fees, for extensions at no cost for students who need to stay in Australia but can't afford, obviously, or shouldn't have to pay in many cases to extend their visa. So there's a lot of issues in that student visa package that we're very keen to get through the Parliament or through the federal cabinet very quickly. And in all of this, I guess because we are a federal system of government, and that causes many of us a lot of pain, and I was a state member of Parliament in Victoria, some of you know, for 18 years. So we have to acknowledge we do have a federal system, but unfortunately, not every state's come forward with a package for bringing international students back into their state. And the federal government is saying, well, unless state governments come forward and territory governments come forward with proposals that include quarantine, that include what we're calling safe or secure corridors, then those states will not receive new cohorts or new groups of international students. So at this stage, we do know that South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, their premiers have come out strongly in support, and I know that states such as Queensland are working on proposals, but until we have the premier of each state come forward, I'm not optimistic that those states will get cohorts of students in July, September, October, and might be pushed back until February next year in some cases. And then we'll go on to my final slide, which is really, I guess, some of the learning so far as hopefully we come out of this pandemic. And one of those is that clearly, again, it goes back to communicating the benefits of what we do. Unfortunately, the wider community and governments don't seem to support particularly our public universities politically the way that we would hope. And so therefore, the tens of thousands of university-based employees who would normally have thought they would have qualified for job assistance and the JobKeeper program, for example, have been denied access to that. And obviously that's cause for concern, and it's going to have major impacts on staffing profiles, on budgets for our 39 public universities, and indeed for the job security of many people in our sector who've been doing wonderful work in support of international education for many years. So we just hope that common sense will prevail there. The other point really is that there seems to be this sort of misnomer, this sort of perception that's quite wrong, that the sum total of Australia's international education revolves around those 39 public universities. In reality, our public TAFE or community colleges, our high schools, our private high schools and our government high schools, private providers of vocational education and higher education actually make up 1/3 of our international education sector. And that's unfortunately overlooked by many politicians and decision makers in many of the decisions they're making. Key market, of course, of China will remain very important, subject to major geopolitical impacts. People say, well, why have we relied on China so much? Well, it comes down to the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that China has the highest population of any country in the world. It has an appetite for global education, and obviously with the one-child policy up until recently, more middle-class families have been able to save funds perhaps, or have been willing to save funds to give their child an offshore education experience. So yes, China's 35% of our market, India is around 17% and so on, but most of our education providers have really tried hard to diversify their markets, but China will remain a very important market. In all of this, of course, what we've learned is that media attention in our sector initially was quite helpful, because I think the media sort of woke up themselves to the fact in Australia that international education is worth $40 billion a year to our economy, that it employs over 240,000 Australians in jobs. And so on the one hand, media commentary sort of helped get the message out there, but on the other hand, unfortunately, some of the media has become quite vitriolic, quite negative, and that hasn't been helpful. And then obviously in all of this, our own Australian students have been affected. Our wonderful New Colombo Plan federal government scholarship program obviously has now not been able to send 13,000 students who are estimated to go offshore this year, and they won't probably ever be able to get that offshore experience, because many of them will then graduate domestically without the chance to have an offshore study abroad experience. And we've got finally to the point in Australia where 1 in 5 of our undergraduates has been having a learning abroad or study abroad experience, and it's a real shame in terms of making Australia better connected with our own region that we can't get more young people offshore. As I went to Japan when I was 17 for a year and got to compare and contrast my culture with other cultures, and learn a lot about my country by living away from my country. So that's it from me, and I look forward to some thought-provoking questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Much appreciated. There have been some questions come in already, so steel yourself for those towards the end. Thank you for those that have submitted. Just a reminder before we go to the next presenter, reminder to those or some information to those people who weren't able to join us at the very beginning. You're able to submit questions at any time through the app on the webinar app. Please type in your questions. I will read those out towards the end and get through as many as possible. And those that we don't manage to answer on the webinar, we should be able to answer through some follow-up afterwards. So thank you, Phil. We appreciate that. Okay, the next speaker we have is Andrew Wharton. He's a client director in the IDP Connect ANZ team, one of my colleagues, and with a speciality in our IQ services, which is all of the IDP Connect data and research. So Andrew's going to spend some time just recutting or looking at some different aspects of the recent IDP Connect research that we undertook and published a couple of weeks ago. Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, James. And first of all, thanks AIEC for the opportunity to share some of the key findings from this recent survey of IDP applicants and offer holders, offering insight into their perceptions, intentions, and current needs, which we really hope can offer some guidance to institutions as they shape their solutions for students, as well as providing support for the work of IEAA and Austrade, amongst others. So over the next 15 minutes or so, we'll examine to what degree students are holding on to their international study plans. And we'll look into their key concerns and the type of assistance and clarity that they seek from institutions and government to help guide them. And we'll consider what we can do to help minimise the possibility of their switching to other destinations. So we're going to start by considering student intent and the decisions they are now making, particularly with regard to deferring and their amenability to studying online. So I'm going to turn my camera off now, so I have a bigger screen for the visuals that are to come. So just for context, first of all, the survey was out in the field for a 10-day period in late April, went out to current IDP applicants and offer holders. There were close to 7,000 students that responded from 72 different nationalities, and the majority from IDP's key recruitment markets. Close to a third had applied to an Australian institution, so 2,241, and that's where we're going to focus predominantly today. So if we look at that Australian cut in a little bit more detail, you can see that a third, or approximately a third of applicants were from India. The majority, 59%, were at postgraduate level, and there was a good split across the states of Australia. The applicants were at different stages of their journey. The majority were offer holders, 70%, 10% were waiting on offers, and a minority had already put their studies on hold. They'd withdrawn their application or decided to study in their home country. And we can see that the overriding factors there are the uncertainty over their ability to travel and safety concerns in their destination country. I would bring to your attention the fact that 13% cited not feeling welcomed, a throwback perhaps to the government announcement at the outbreak of the pandemic, encouraging some students to return to their home countries. So into the findings, we asked students to rate key countries' responses to COVID-19. And Australia was generally seen as having managed the virus response well, with 22% of students claiming that they had a changed perception of Australia as a result of the pandemic. This is lower than the US and the UK, though it does fall well behind Canada and New Zealand, who are perceived to have responded to the crisis better, to be a safer place to be, and have considered the welfare of students better than Australia. And when we look at the reasons for that perception change, well, there was some positivity. The perception change is mainly negative. So on the right there, in yellow, is the more positive comments, and on the left, is the more in orange, the more negative comments. So really, the negative perception change can be attributed to the perceived government and institution reaction, the perceived racial discrimination, as well as the perception of the number or rate of infections. So we then asked students if they still expected to commence their studies as planned. And the good news is that there remains great intent to study in Australia. At least 68% of students are holding on to their aspiration, with just 5% no longer intending to study as planned. But there's a significant minority that are still undecided. And it's worth noting that the intent to start as planned increases for 2021 start dates, perhaps indicating a belief that solutions will be found in the coming months that allow them to do so. So when we start unpacking the data and comparing at a more granular level, on the next slide, please, Katie. The feeling of confidence in starting as planned was particularly apparent amongst Western Australian students, perhaps due to regional migration incentives and or perceptions that Western Australia has been relatively unaffected by the pandemic, maybe quicker to accept students. Just noting here that there's no ACT, Tasmanian or Northern Territory category. There simply wasn't enough the sample size to include. And when we take a view of the data at the applicant's study level, we can see that the intent to start as planned was particularly high amongst vocational students, perhaps due to post-study work being a key driver for this group and something which may be seen as even more important if their home country is harder hit economically than Australia. They may be even more committed to their study plans with perceived stronger job opportunities and a better health system in Australia. So we next asked students about their mindset towards online delivery. And I've split this by state with the Australian view on the left of each category in grey, and then the states, as you can see, red for Victoria, orange for New South Wales, yellow for Queensland, blue for South Australia, and green for Western Australia. So I'll just allow you to digest that for a second. So on the left, at least 34% of applicants would defer rather than start their studies online. They want campus experience. And amongst the states, we can see that the deferral is the much preferred option for Western Australian applicants. At least 33% would start online as long as there's a transition to face-to-face. And we've not shown this here, but worth noting that a higher proportion of undergraduate students indicated a willingness to start online and transition to face-to-face teaching, compared to the postgraduate counterparts who appear more tempted to defer. Only about 10% are willing to undertake full online learning, and amongst states, we can see South Australia leads the way here, and there is 16% still undecided. So if we now look at the more deeply into those with intent to defer, we asked them how long they were willing to defer to enable them to commence study face-to-face. 19% said they'd wait as long as it takes. That's very positive. 57% are willing to defer for up to 3 months. This reduces to 42% for 6 months, and only 14% if they have to wait for a year. 23% not in a position to say just yet. So looking at differences by state, Victoria and Western Australian students are willing to defer for slightly longer periods, while New South Wales students seem most uncertain. But what is clear is that there's a window of opportunity to retain these students, but it is fairly limited. Next slide, please, Katie. So if we look now at those willing to study online at the start of their course, there is a great deal of uncertainty here as students grapple with their decisions on this. 40% remain undecided. And at least 57% expressed a willingness to start online for up to 3 months, but this drops sharply with just 21% willing to do so for 6 months and 5%, just 5% for up to a year. There was little variance by state on this one, but some variance by subject area, with those studying more practical, hands-on programs, perhaps concerned over how effectively they can be transferred online while maintaining the quality of the academic experience. And this is, of course, something to consider for when students return to campus and the prioritization that will be required to allow face-to-face teaching and perhaps selecting specific programs. Next slide, please, Katie. We explored the reasons for this limited acceptance of online study. And the primary concerns cited were the lack of international exposure, quality of teaching experience, the preference for a personal learning style, as well as the impact on post-study opportunities. post-study work opportunities. So in essence, online is on trial. There are some 60,000 Chinese student visa holders currently outside Australia as of April who have not deferred and are studying online. And I think their experience of their first semester of online learning looks like being crucial to both their continuance of their studies as well as the future cohort's acceptance of online study. And it will be important, I think, for institutions to give students the reassurance that they need with regard to the quality of teaching and its suitability for individuals without prior experience. Those are things that perhaps can be controlled. Perhaps the lack of international exposure, something that can be controlled to a lesser extent. So considering the concerns that students have around online learning and the length of time they're willing to wait to start their studies online, we asked students how likely they would be to change destination country if it meant they're being able to start with face-to-face learning. And more than 1 in 5 students would switch destinations if they had the ability. This, of course, presents a significant opportunity for Australia if robust student-centric solutions can be found early. Obviously, Australia is in a very strong position compared to some of its competitor destinations. If it doesn't, then Australia could face increased competition, particularly from Canada and perhaps the UK, particularly if those countries shift intake dates, as they're starting to do. And looking at this on a state level, applicants from Queensland and New South Wales seem most likely to switch destinations. And this has a direct correlation with how students select their institution. So on the next slide, please, Katie, we asked a series of questions around student motivations at the time of their application. So in this case, we asked students how important subject, institution, and destination country were in their considerations. And this slide shows the relative importance of subject, institution, and destination country by state. See, for every state, subject is ranked first, but the destination country is ranked last for New South Wales and Queensland students, perhaps indicating lesser loyalty to Australia for these cohorts. So next, we're going to look at the type of support and assistance that students are expecting of institutions and government in response to the challenges they're currently facing. So we asked students how they could be best assisted in deciding their immediate study options. It was clear that there's a great desire for regular communication and information flow across a range of medium. Email for policy updates, webinars for information sessions, and more personal conversations with institutions as well as in-country representatives about individual study plans. But also really interesting to note, I think, that there's a great interest in understanding more from peers about the online learning experience. So you can see that 21% would like to read more from students about their online learning experience, 17% video testimonials. So there's a great interest in understanding more about how that experience would map out for them and whether they'd be willing to accept that as a study option. We also asked students in free text form, what's the best way that institutions can help them at the current time? We received almost 1,000 comments on this, and we're just displaying a selection here grouped into key categories, so which reflect the common support requests. So communication, financial assistance, online learning advice, and health and safety. We haven't got much time to sort of dwell on these, so I'm just going to pass through this. So we asked the same question of government support. Again, almost 1,000 comments, and again, we're displaying a selection that's centered around communication, the travel restrictions in place, financial assistance, visa-related concerns, and health and safety. But it's probably easier to put this into a chart format. So by way of summary on this, there's a lot of crossover in the type of support that was requested, perhaps indicating some lack of understanding amongst students about the scope of influence of institutions as compared to government. We've grouped them together here into six main categories in terms of the relative importance and how frequently this type of request for assistance came up. So contact and support was most in demand. Contact relates to the communication of announcements and policy changes, and it's expected from institutions as well as from government, with the provision of contact points and hotlines for questions being particularly requested. So clearly a need for consistency in messaging between institutions and government there. And support here includes what really refers to non-monetary assistance to ensure basic needs are met, such as food and accommodation availability. The online delivery aspect relates to assurance on quality and suitability, and assurance that it's only an interim measure. And from the financial side, yes, there's requests for tuition fee reductions and scholarships, but it's also about broader financial welfare at government level, at least, to account for reduced availability of part-time work. Deferring entry is the assurance that seats won't be lost on deferring, and the ease of process to enter the country at a later date. Health and safety is assurances around the availability of testing and the provision of medical assistance if required and without discrimination. And visas is for online visa processing and priority processing when restrictions are eased, as well as the impact on post-study work. So to sort of sum up what we found were the primary learnings from this piece of research. Firstly, that international students are still motivated to follow through with their study plans, but that the nature of their concerns and the nature of the reassurance they require really does vary by student cohort, whether they're from whether they apply to different states or for them different origin countries. And the policies and communications need to be tailored to suit that variety. We only have a limited window of opportunity to help international students commence studies. They want the face-to-face experience, but they won't, and they'll defer, but not for long. You know, say up to 6 months, possibly 12 months, and much less so. Some students are willing to start online, but not for long, and only as a means to get to face-to-face study. And where supporting online commencement, applicants need to be reassured of the quality, their suitability, so the support they would receive, and the value of the online experience. And students seek clarity and understanding of their options and support through regular communications through multiple channels and from different stakeholders, from their institution, from government, from their agents in country, and from their peers. So what are some possible next steps and solutions? I think firstly, the sector needs to communicate unified messages through channels on and offshore. I think obviously the whole visa issue around studying online will hopefully be coming soon, according to Phil there from the Home Affairs. But really supporting students through the online experience and giving them everything they need in terms of allowing post-study work rights, priority processing for when the time comes for them to land on campus. And students need a clear response on the impacts of post-study work rights if studies are started online. And we need to think about student welfare as they do start to arrive in country, whether that be later this year or the start of next. So perhaps homestay options with quarantine, mental health checks, virtual counselling, and full medical support, and to consider social connections at a time of what are likely to be restrictions still in place. So I think that's all for me. I'll hand you back to the studio and Jane.
Thank you, Andrew. Back in the studio here. Really interesting stuff there. Obviously, data is so important to help us all make informed decisions at any time, but particularly now, and that's very relevant, up-to-date data from a large number of students in the IDP pipeline with applications and offers and looking to make decisions. So thank you for that. Thank you for those who have submitted questions already. We've got a number coming through, so I'm just scanning through those as we go. Anyone that's had technical issues, thank you for your patience. I suggest if you do have any issues with sound or freezing, most people I think are fine, so it could be just a case of rejoining the webinar and kicking it along again. For those who have joined us late, please submit any questions, written questions through the app, and I'll go through those at the end and we'll answer as many as possible. One question we've had a few times is about just accessing the slides after the webinar. So for those who weren't here at the start, we will make the full recording available, which will include all the slides and of course all the commentary that goes with them. The full recording will be available so you can access the slides that way. Okay, so on to our final but by no means least presenter, known to everybody, needs very little introduction. So fortunately, Rebecca, I'll give you very little introduction other than say, please take the floor, Rebecca Hall.
Thank you very much, James. And looking at the time here as well, I'm sure people will want me to move quickly, although you are in the comfort of your own home, so perhaps you are already enjoying your evening break. So I am rounding out the presentations today and going to bring hopefully three perspectives as part of this presentation. The first, just a quick recap on current state. And global perceptions from some work that Austrade led following the bushfires, which I think is quite telling for where we are now. How we're working together with states and territories and other agencies, and a quick look at what it might take for us to be together again. And Katie's driving my slide deck, so we'll just move through to the first slide, please, Katie. So current state, particularly for those who are not from Australia and have not seen this data before, and as Phil touched on as well, really important in the Australian context, our state and territory breakdown and partners. And so this slide is unpacking the current data. And I think one of the benefits for us out of this process has indeed been the speed and the collaboration between agencies in sharing data, which is helping us understand where students are, but also where those needs are. And you can see our key countries and course areas there as well. So just for foundation, one of the things I wanted to move to in the next slide is our, that's my dog in the background, sorry, is some early insights from the tracking work that we did around perceptions of Australia during the bushfires. Phil mentioned the Global Reputation Task Force, and in fact, hard to recall, but the task force was first set up in response to the bushfires and how we were managing our global reputation. So today I'm going to share with you just a few slides that are summarising across the 7 markets that we looked at perception. So India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, the UK, the USA, and China, of course, and giving you an insight into what parents and students were thinking at that time. This was undertaken in February, so just prior to the IDP research that you just saw, and of course as COVID was beginning to escalate around the world. So we'll go to next slide. Thanks. So this is, obviously there's a huge piece of work behind this, but for this afternoon and given the time, I just wanted to focus on some top level insights. So this is how students and parents were responding to the perception of Australia during the fires. Of course, green is that which is a higher or a positive sentiment, orange middle, and red lower. And hopefully you can see and read that there. But this is very interesting for how we position against other destinations as well. Looking at, let me start from the top, of course, education, where we all sit, and that safety and security retaining there at in the positive. Economy, governance, safety, environment, lifestyle and culture, and of course, overall sentiment. So I'll just go to the next slide. I thought this was really interesting, particularly given Phil's comments around the role of media and others in either helping us get messages out or indeed perpetuating some negative messaging. And this is a very busy slide and I don't have enough time, so I'll cut to the chase. The corporate voice is our greatest chance of promoting a positive narrative across key countries. And that is, if you look at those in the red across the top, across any one of those countries that were surveyed, those who were getting their news from current affairs on TV, on websites, or on social media, and to a lesser extent newspapers, we're tending to have a negative perception. Those that were engaging with those formal channels, to Andrew's call out there at the end as well, those trusted sites, indeed even word of mouth, tended to then have a more a better perception and a higher level of awareness. I'll go to the next slide, and I'll just close this piece on two insights. Obviously, Australia and many of you channeling AIEC know that we've been talking about Australia's nation brand and how we are planning to apply that to education. And so I think from this work that we saw with the bushfires sentiment, four key opportunities for us. Our people are our strength. We saw this come through in how the media was covering us then. We know even in the insights we're seeing now, safe and secure and friendly people and friendly and welcoming society are critical to our success as a sector and in continuing to welcome students. The Australian resilience is something that is known, that is understood, and again, I think we are showing this through COVID-19. Some of the areas that we want to leverage as we continue to move forward in terms of our brand is our optimism, our resourcefulness, and of course our creativity, and continuing to promote those and the role that they play for us on a global stage. And we do need to address the quality perceptions. In the data that I showed you around the bushfires, obviously some opportunities there, but also when we look at that in education, I think it's really interesting seeing that come through in online perceptions of quality as well. I'll go to the next slide. What can we learn and what did we learn from the bushfires and how we can apply this to future crisis? And indeed, we are doing this right now. So the data showed negative become more negative. So we can spend time and effort to convince an audience, or we can work with an audience who understands us and make sure that they also are aware of our benefits. Resilience is critical. We need to continue to communicate the impacts, so showing and articulating the reality, but also how we're addressing the issues. And as I said earlier, leveraging the corporate voice. So hopefully that's been a good walkthrough of some of the insights in the global perception. I'll move to the next slide, and I think the next element of my quick summary on what working together for renewal looks like. And in this section, I'll go to the next slide. One of the things that we have been working on, obviously many of you would know Austrade and work with us regularly. Our role is to promote and support international education globally. Obviously a great network of experts and education trade commissioners who work in partnership with colleagues in Department of Education, Home Affairs and Foreign Affairs. One of the things that we've been trialling this year is actually extending that broader whole of government partnership with our state and territory partners. And I think it has been a key to us working together and getting the key messages out. Obviously, there are different sizes of cohorts and different ways of working, but we've really been trying to focus this effort and know we need to continue to do that. I'll go to the next slide. Thank you. Just a quick summary here of the work that Austrade has been doing around our priority actions following COVID, and nine pivots, if you like. Hopefully none of these are a surprise to you, and I won't spend too much time here other than to say for us, a lot of this work was already in play. And I know many of you in your institutions had already been investing in digital, in online, in new ways of collecting intelligence and or student acquisition. So these are the core areas that we've been focused on, and obviously are hoping to deliver benefit for the sector and for Australia as we move into post-COVID world. Given the title of today's webinar, I really wanted to pick up on the In This Together call to action, which has really galvanised certainly us as state and territories that are promoting Australia as a destination. And actually, this slide just shares how this organically was created back in February through our partners in Study Queensland and a group of students. And it's helped us, I think, come together, identify where the opportunities are for us to sell the sum of the whole, not just its parts, and also to gather the good news stories and those cases of success and of resilience, and to showcase them to the world. And a number of our posts are implementing campaigns and initiatives around this for key audiences, and I would use the China team as an example for that, really focusing on unpacking some great stories of students who are learning online, who are enjoying that experience and what we can take from them in terms of that experience. I'll go to the next slide. And this is the final piece of my presentation today. So hashtag and a question mark, together again. What might it take for us to return? You may notice that I've purposely been using the word renewal, not necessarily recovery, because there is a long way to go. And let me just share a couple of thoughts on what this could look like. I know we've spoken about this in a range of different ways, but for me, when I'm unpacking and trying to communicate to an agent audience or indeed a student audience, what it will take for us to shape what's next, there are 4 key factors. Obviously, how well we as a country and as individual states progress along the 3-step roadmap. That is the the key measure, the key go no go for us to even consider what an open borders Australia might look like. And of course, we know from sentiment actually collected recently as well that this message from the government was very well received in key markets and by students. But we know that's not the only step that we need to take. I think secondly, of course, is how well our source countries and indeed our competitors recover, and not just from a health perspective, but also economic and indeed politically. Number 3, how student and parent buyer behaviours are changing, and full credit to the team at IDP who are building us a bank of information and evidence to understand these changes during COVID. And here I'm also quoting some work that we did last year, Austrade and IDP, and presented at AIEC on the role of parents. And it would be fascinating to relook at that this year as well, because I think parents, we know, were always very influential in student choice, but I can imagine now perhaps even more so given the climate. So that's number 3. And number 4, it is indeed how our current students are experiencing Australian education, whether it is those students who are here in Australia or those who are online. And we know this because their word of mouth and their experience is a very powerful tool in our marketing toolkit. And obviously, we want to be able to meet the needs of those students and continue to be able to welcome more. So I'll go to what is my final slide, and hopefully in enough time for questions. I was thinking about, obviously this is an AIEC Connect session, and some of the things we would be talking about in person at AIEC. So just trying to close here with my personal observations on key takeaways for the sector and where we stand right now. And you could say this for any sector or any part of our lives, I guess, but COVID has certainly shone a light on the things that we're good at, but also on the things that perhaps weren't working so well. And I think we've actually made huge strides in areas where we hadn't been able to move previously, but also having to address some of those challenges. As I just said, the student voice, and it's never been more true, is the most powerful tool for harvesting feedback, improvements and referral. And I think we really need to continue to find better ways to gather and act on this. I don't know about you. I don't know how many webinars you've done today or how many video conferences you've been on or virtual events that you've attended. Fantastic to see our recruitment move so quickly to virtual events. But I do wonder, are we getting cut through? And maybe being provocative too, I'd love to hear your feedback on that. And what would it look like if we actually could create a uniquely Australian experience that enables us to attract more students? Number 4, key markets to watch. Now, I have picked 5 markets here: China, India, Brazil, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And for me, I've chosen them all for very different reasons. And I'm not going to have time to share those reasons with you today, but in the spirit of AIEC as well, I really do hope that we get a chance for many of our trade commissioners and experts around the world to share with you what they're seeing in key markets. I am positive that and optimistic that Australia can lead in all modes of international education. And this is our chance to build back or to realign our narrative around not just our inbound student cohort, but our excellent T&E facilities and programs, our in-country delivery, and our high-quality online experience. In other words, studying with Australia, not just in Australia. And I'll close on remembering an AIEC keynote presentation from a couple of years back, noting the impacts on our sector of government policy, whether it's at home or in sending and host countries. And of course, I think we need to prepare ourselves that this will be no different, and what is the opportunity for us to shape that renewal together. I will leave that there. There's some further contact details on the next slide if we just put them up for people to see, and otherwise back to you, James.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks to all the presenters. We have had a slew of questions coming through. I'm trying to work my way through them and find some with commonality. There are a number of questions about different subjects, but you know, on similar subjects, so I'll try and get through those. Some seem more obvious for one or other of the presenters, but please feel free to jump in, any of you, if you have a response. So excuse me while I look to one side. I just need to look on a different screen for the main questions. One subject which has been coming through fairly regularly, which I think it'd be helpful to comment on, is the question of the current situation between Australia and China, the tensions there, and what the impact may be immediately and in the future for the international education sector as we work through this. So I don't know, Phil or Rebecca, whether you've got any thoughts on that you can share.
Probably harder for Rebecca because she's a senior public servant who's just been promoted further up the poll, so congratulations, Rebecca. But let's be hopeful and hope that the trade issues are limited to barley and beef, which at least have got some official cover when it comes to labelling and other alleged misdemeanors that we won't debate here. So hopefully a line will be drawn on those two commodities when it comes to concerns about Australian trade issues and potential barriers to entry there. And I think all credit to our Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, who's done a very good job in difficult circumstances in stressing the friendship between Australia and China and stressing the need for objective discussion rather than any pointing of fingers from either side. I still think that most Chinese families, through word of mouth, know that Australia is a safe, welcoming, culturally diverse study destination. They know that young Australians are going over there to study as well in increasing numbers, and they know, even from family members and friends who've come to Australia as tourists, that whether it be our climate, whether it be, well, I'm here in Melbourne today, whether it be our climate or whether it be our wonderful clean green image, we've got a lot to offer, together with world-class qualifications. And I think, to my point earlier, that other countries who unfortunately haven't been able to contain the virus in as timely a manner as we've been able to achieve, partly we have to acknowledge because we're an island continent, so it's been suited our geopolitical or our geography advantage there. I think that we'll find that Australia will be seen as an appropriate place to continue sending students to study.
And James, I would say I'd leave that a proper answer from Rhett Miller, our Trade Commissioner in China, and perhaps we could do a special session on that.
Great, that would be great, Rebecca, if that could happen. Just moving through, there's a number of questions. I think, Phil, you did cover it off early on, but a number of questions about visas and post-study work visas. They may be from some people that weren't able to join us at the very beginning. Are you able to share what you're aware of at the moment in terms of any changes in visa policy that may be about to come out?
Yes, so thanks to some good work by some of my IAA board members. I'll do a shout out to Mike Ferguson from University of Canberra and Melissa Banks, my president, and Janelle Chapman, my vice president, who is in charge of TAFE Queensland International. We put together a shopping list of woes, if you like, that we bowled up to Acting Immigration Minister Alan Tudge, and that's a list of approximately 12 visa flexibilities that we thought the sector was keen to see some movement on. Minister Tudge has assured me that that list has been trickled back down through the Home Affairs Department, and certainly in conversation with the Deputy Secretary of the Department, I know that they have been working on that list. Clearly, because, as I mentioned earlier, some of those visa flexibilities, be it fee waivers, be it visa extensions, do involve revenue implications, then by law, there's a requirement that they at least signed off by Cabinet, the Federal Government Cabinet process. And on that basis, we're just waiting for that package to work its way up the queue of issues that Federal Cabinet are having to make decisions on. So I've been assured by the Minister that we're imminently anticipating the package being released. And once it's done, then of course we can get on with being far more transparent around returning students coming back, around post-study work right flexibility, around the component of online learning and how that factors into a range of time-lapse situations. So we're quietly confident that something will come out soon. Bear in mind, James, that of course New Zealand, the UK, other countries have really come out quickly with their visa flexibilities compared to us.
Thanks, Phil. If there's no other comments, I'll move on to the next one. This one's specifically for you, Andrew, with regard to the survey data. Question is, did you observe any significant variances in intentions for students from the different key source markets?
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. But there's so much data to unpack. I think what might be an idea is we actually built a series of dashboards that we so we can interrogate the data more easily using more data points. One of which being country of origin. If I'm just going to try and share my screen, and I can try and query. So, Katie, can you see my screen? Or James?
Yes, can see it.
Yeah. So, yeah, we built these dashboards to allow that filtering to look at a more granular level, and the kind of detail that's available in here is individual origin country, individual destination country, more granular locations or groups of institutions within destination countries. So study status, subject areas, level of study, and different intake dates. So just to give you a sample, which one shall I? Let me get this one. So the question around what's your mindset towards online delivery, and if we just look at the data for Australia as a destination, you won't remember, but I do, that 34% was the figure as across all markets looking to study in Australia. 34% was the figure that was for deferral. And we can see the key markets there, India and China, are at 44% deferral, so significantly higher than the average. And then if you looked at something like the Philippines, if you combine these two, I don't know if you can see those, but those are the online willingness to study online, either full or transitioning to face-to-face. And the Philippines, 65% of respondents were willing to either start or complete their program online. So I'll sort of leave that there. There's a lot of ways you can query the data, but there are some significant differences across origin countries. I think while I am here, I think just to Phil's point around the fact that we're looking for that post-study work government announcement in the short term, and I was actually looking at the data to see what was the impact of Canada's recent announcement to include online study as part of as a component with post-study work right. Just before I do that, if you look at, you may be interested in seeing how our traffic to our digital platform has mapped out over the last 12 months or so. So we can see different destination countries here: Canada, UK, Australia in yellow, US and New Zealand. You can see around the time when the pandemic was announced in March, there was a steep decline in students researching their options, but that has actually just recently started trending back upwards. We've got a gradual increase of students going back to their research, starting to consider future study plans. This is the pre-applicant cohort, and actually traffic levels are back up to the same sort of levels they were 12 months ago. But I think more interestingly than that, I think it's the share that we're seeing change. And so if we look at the change from Canada in the last couple of weeks, it's kind of just spiked up again at the expense really of the UK. And if you look at that on a particular origin country where post-study work is very important, then that's really more aggressively seen if it comes through. So yeah, 50% in Canada, 21% the UK, 18% in Australia. So really Canada stealing a march again in the Indian market.
So James, if I could just support that, IAA did some really good research report publications around this issue of post-study work right intentions, and of course it won't come as much of a surprise to many people that Chinese students have less of an appetite for post-study work right visas compared to Nepalese and Indian students, and that has basically been a trend for years now. So again, interest in post-study work right visas does vary quite markedly between student source countries.
Agreed. Thank you. Thanks both for that. I've got a specific question for Rebecca regarding your research, the reputation data actually. So there's some interest in knowing if this is being fed into broader soft power initiatives. So not just the marketing branding, but also other aspects such as scholarships and broader engagement. Are you able to talk to that for a moment?
Yeah, that's a great question I'm talking to, because yes, actually Austrade led this work on behalf of the government. So one of the key points that we wanted to make following the bushfires was to have a common view across governments. This is I'm just share with you a little tip of the iceberg. It is going in to inform obviously how we're applying our nation brand efforts, how we're working together across agencies, even of course for those who might be involved in policy development as well. We conducted that back in February. ideally, and as we have done with the research that informed Nation brand, we're usually in the market every 6 to 12 months. So we hope to be able to get comparable data as well. And of course, our colleagues at DFAT who are leading on soft power certainly would also be looking and considering this work. I did just want to give a plug. So that was all offshore. One of the initiatives that we're delivering with our Study Australia partners from probably semester 2 or in July is to start a quarterly onshore student sentiment tracker, which will involve similar questions in that main offshore one, but also add important information to help us deliver the right information to students and to deal with some of their questions. That will be running 4 times over the 12 months they're in, and we think and hope that will provide a really important resource for the sector and also for us in government.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. We've got a lot of questions here, probably time for 1 or 2 more. Phil, this one's probably more in your particular area of interest and sphere of activity. Question is, given the possibility of the Pacific travel bubble, not easy to say, does this offer an opportunity to institutions to look towards the Pacific for new Colombo Plan activities and recruitment, as well as other institutional arrangements?
Yes, the Pacific Islands clearly have not been a very big market for higher education, and you know, all power to some of the universities there, such as the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. But they've definitely been a very strong vocational education market for Australia, particularly on Train the Trainer. I know my Vice President Janelle Chapman has led a number of cohorts of teachers and bringing students in on, and also I'm aware that some TAFEs in WA are also very big on supporting training for InVet for Pacific Islands. So the challenge is, you know, we're talking small cohorts, we're talking not very large populations in the Pacific, and obviously the Kiwis and New Zealanders who are online would say that often international students go to New Zealand for English language and diplomas, but Australia gets them subsequently. So we're very happy to keep taking students through that New Zealand secure corridor, hopefully. But look, there's a market there, but we have to be much more targeted in terms of what we can promote to some of those smaller cohort countries.
Phil, sorry, just scrolling through here. I think I'm just checking the clock. I'm going to try and find a quick question because I know we're running up against the barrier here. Bear with me. Sorry, everyone. The questions I'm looking at here are rather long ones, and I think we've only got a minute or two left here. Rebecca, if you can, in a very short time, I know in your presentation you identified some key markets that you had identified for a number of reasons. There's one question here in particular asking for a bit more information about Brazil and Indonesia. So if you're able to sum that up in a minute or 2, that might be helpful for the broader audience as well.
I was laughing, James, because I thought you might find a quick question, but then will we deliver you a quick answer? So actually, and thank you whoever asked that question for those 2 countries, because there is rationale there. Brazil has been and is a very significant market for Australia. We do know that a number of our students from Latin America, more than others, are presenting with complex hardship challenges. And also are in different locations. I haven't looked at the data on a regional level, but for Gold Coast, for example, Brazil is their #1 student cohort, so quite a localised experience. Brazil is the example I use because even if Brazilian students still want to come and study with us, when your economy and or your exchange rates have devalued or are so out of whack, I think we will have some challenges in being able to bring back that same cohort. That said, there are opportunities for us, of course, to open up new opportunities. whether that's from other destinations who may not be open or available. Indonesia, I would have to say, and I spoke about the notion of studying with Australia, our transnational opportunities and our partnership opportunities in Indonesia following the ratification of the AIEC are, I think, a great opportunity for us to re-engage in the region. And yeah, we have wonderful trade commissioners in both of those locations who, if you want to hear more, we'd love to bring them back and share that.
Excuse me. Thanks, Rebecca. I think we need to wrap up now. We're about to hit our allotted time. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. Apologies we couldn't get to all of them. There's a lot of good questions, a lot of good suggestions, in fact, so we'll look through those and give responses as best we can after the webinar. We appreciate you joining us from wherever you are, as I said, across Australia and around the world. Thank you to our panelists, to Andrew, Rebecca, and Phil. Thank you for the insights that you have and for sharing them with the audience. It just leaves for me to say thanks again. Stay safe, stay connected, and look out for more activities from AIEC, and thank you for coming.